Welcome to Soul Night Live, episode number 84. Today, our guest is Jack Hues, and my co host is Rob LaDuca. Hey, good evening, Jack.
Hey, is that
Good
Rob?
evening also from here.
Hey, Rob. Yeah. How you doing, guys?
Doing
Great.
well, doing well.
Good.
Rob's out in the deep of space today, but
Yeah.
he knows it well.
Yeah, I recognize that nebula or whatever it is.
Your nebula
Wait,
looks rather
did you say
familiar.
Ned or nerd? That's a difference. I know what a Ned is in British lingo.
Nice shirt, man. It's good.
Thank you.
Well, thanks a million for taking time out of your evening to come and chat with us today. I'm real
It's a real
excited to discuss what you've been up to lately and talk about the new book and your most recent album, little Wang Chung too, and
Sure.
all in good time. So I was kind of curious just what you've been up to as of late. Like, what are your days consisting of right now?
Right now, well, I guess in the UK, it feels like we're coming out of the lockdown. So it means I can go out and go to shops and buy things. So yeah, I just got hold of that new, one of my favorite albums ever is John Lennon's Plastic Ono Band.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah. The first one. Yeah.
Come out as a sort of multi-CD, all the takes you ever wanted to hear and some you probably never wanted to hear. So I've availed myself of that. So yes, I'm sort of treating myself to a few little things, and I guess I'm in a bit of a holding pattern for last year. Instead of frittering my time away touring in the States on maybe Primitif or Wang Chung even, because of the lockdown, I stayed home and made a whole new solo album. So that's currently in production in the Netherlands, because we don't have any more record pressing plants in the UK, which is
Even for CDs, huh?
Wow.
CDs we do, yeah, but not,
okay.
not the vinyl. Yeah. So these days I tend to think in terms of vinyl. I don't know why, just regressing, I guess. So yeah, so this record's in production, and so I'm thinking about gigs maybe later on in the year to support that. We made a video, so all the little bits and pieces that you start looking at to try and promote and make people aware of the fact that there's an amazing new Jack Hues solo album.
Are you at liberty to divulge the title?
I probably shouldn't actually, but I think I will actually. So it's called Electroacoustic Works 2020. So the idea is that, that these are pieces that I wrote during 2020, during this lockdown, and a lot of the album is kind of not exactly about or inspired by, but triggered by, it's part of the whole vibe that all of us have been through.
And is there more of an acoustic emphasis on this one?
Well, funny you should say that, because I started out thinking about doing some acoustic versions of some jazz standards, particularly some Thelonious Monk things, but I sort of gave up on that. Actually, I thought, because with jazz, I sort of feel, it's so highly professionalized these days. That there's a bit of, for young people looking at it, they maybe think it's just too hard, and I know that certain things in my career made me think I can do this. One of them was Miles Davis's album, Kind of Blue, So I was quite late in my life. Is like in the 90s, so I was in my 40s when I first heard that album, and what it made me think was, I get how this is. Yeah, you can make us sort of, you can write as a jazz composer, you can play solos without having to be stratospherically kind of technically gifted. It's really, as all good music, it's all about expression.
Sure.
So I thought maybe I
all down here versus up here, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I thought maybe I'd try doing these not very good acoustic guitar versions of jazz standards, so that people could go, oh, I could do that, but they just turned out to be not very good. So I ditched that. But there is one acoustic track left on the album, a new song, but a lot of it is kind of electric. And I guess we got to a place in September, October in the UK where you could sort of work in a studio with people socially distanced and stuff. So I have some other players on it as well. So it's quite ambitious in certain respects. It's a single album this time. You know, I released my solo double album last year. But it's I'd say if you're into prog as a general kind of area of interest, then this album will be of interest.
Excellent.
Awesome.
Excellent. Well,
yeah, I too only got into Miles Davis in my 40s. That was maybe 10 years ago, not quite, but maybe I just wasn't ready for it on certain levels. Yeah.
That's really what it boils down to. I mean, I had grown up in a household where my father played those records, but it was almost like your father's music, you know, you kind of want to run away from it. And you know, and then after, you know, many years and he passed away and all that, it's almost like an homage to go dig into that music and go, oh, now I get it. And it's almost like, I don't know, the passage of time had to happen for me to really have what it takes to appreciate that music anyway. So, you know, I
remember working with Peter Wolf, you know, doing Everybody Have Fun Tonight, the Wang Chung stuff from that album Mosaic. He used to pick me up from the house I was living in LA. We recorded, well, part of it in LA. And we used to sort of, you know, drive to the studio, sometimes go to the gym and stuff. And I remember him playing me Nefertiti one time. And because he was like, you don't know Miles? You know, he's like, mate, listen to this, you know. And I sort of, you know, I liked it. How can you not like that? But the light didn't go on, do you know what I mean? And it did take me another 10 years for me to really get the space that music was in, you know, which is... it was a very different space from what I've been doing with Wang Chung, where everything was a lot more structured and controlled. You know, with Miles, of course, it's about letting the players play and keeping the composition thing, keeping that out of the way almost, you know, just giving people a framework to be brilliant in.
You know, as I grow older, I love these new musical vistas that open up because you start feeling like you've overturned every rock. And then you find some group that you never paid any attention to, and they've got 20 years worth of music to check out, and it's just a wonderful kind of treasure hunt in a way.
It is. And that's older stuff and new bands as well, you know.
Oh sure, absolutely.
That was one thing that struck me I read your article. I was able to see it with my academic credentials.
Yes, I saw that.
You've composed an academic work that I'm going to have to cite somehow in a chemistry paper with Wang Chung et al. Yeah. Anyway, what struck me is your huge ears. That at one point you recognized that your musical tastes had gotten narrower and narrower, and you weren't open to new sounds, and then you broke through, and the whole rest of your life has been, you know, enjoying, you know, standing on the shoulders of giants, enjoying this great music that is there and somehow filtering it into your own art. And I really love that, because when I ran Nearfest, which was the US, I co-ran Nearfest, which was the biggest prog festival in the USA, I would hold out 2 rows in the theater for the other bands to watch the other bands, and they were almost always empty. There were very few musicians that were actually interested in hearing the work of other musicians, and it boggled my mind. But you've broken that mold, so I have infinite respect for you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, but I do remember the time when I wouldn't have been sitting in those seats. You know? But it's not a healthy place to be. You know, it's I think, you know, listening to everything, taking it all in, and hearing it as, you know, endeavor of one sort or another is very important, you know. And I was going to say no judgment. Of course you do judge things by your own taste and so on, you know. But yeah, no, I've got a lot of time for a lot of different musics these days.
You know, it's like you kind of look back on the folly of youth and think, I thought I had it all figured out, and then you realize you don't know anything. And that it's okay, and it kind of feels good because there's lots of new adventures out there for you still.
That's where the word sophomore, coming back to my college gig, sophomore literally means sophos moros, wise fool. It's literally what it means. And we all get in that state where we think we know it all, but we freaking don't.
I just get bored of myself and my tastes and my record collection. It's like, okay, out of all of that, let's reinvent, let's dig, you know.
No, I really experienced that. Yeah. And I think when you're the artist as well, you tend to sort of take the responsibility for digging yourself out of the hole somehow, you know, and it's not always possible. You know, sometimes you have to really like just accept you're in the hole sort of thing and start looking around at what's around you and start using what's there, you know, as opposed to constantly thinking you've got all the answers. And,
sure, absolutely.
And I definitely agree with you guys.
While we're on the subject of Everybody Have Fun Tonight, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about its genesis, how it came together.
That's a different band, Sean.
You're right. It was the 80s, though. No wonder.
Well, he worked with Tony Banks, but anyway.
Yeah, we could.
Yeah, I want to talk about that too, definitely.
Yeah. So Everybody Have Fun Tonight. Yeah, well, I guess as everybody knows, you know, the music business is great. You know, when you have hits and when you don't, it's very tough. You know,
Sure.
So we were in this place where we had to have a sort of top 10, well, really a #1 record. You know. And Nick and I have been working on a sort of follow-up to Points on the Curve, which is the album that had Danceful Days on it. Unfortunately, we've been sidetracked by To Live and Die in LA for a while. So we did that album, well, the soundtrack, you know. And Geffen, our record label, were into it, you know, but they were kind of like, okay, you've had your fun, now you've got to have this. We want the #1 record, you know, you're a top 40 act, you know. So we were with that challenge, and what Nick and I used to meet together, usually at Nick's house, and just play through ideas. We'd meet like every month, and I'd play through ideas I had, he'd play through ideas he had, and most of the time with his ideas I go, no, you know. And then he played this idea, Everybody Have Fun Tonight, just this little chorus idea, and it really stayed with me. I just loved it as an idea, although I heard it as a sort of ironic kind of thing, you know. So rather than it being the party record, it turned out, you know, I sort of thought, yeah, how can anybody have fun tonight in this terrible world, you know? So I'll write Hey Jude again.
Right.
So we sort of did this sort of ballad version of it, you know, which had the many of the ingredients in the finished thing. But when we started working with Peter Wolf, who was the producer, whose job it was to make that #1 record, you know, he's kind of like, no, we need to make this a proper party record, you know. And I was like, no, you can't do that. And he said, yeah, the chorus is Everybody Have Fun Tonight, everybody Wang Chung tonight. And I was like, no, that's just a sort of ad-lib idea, you know. But he was adamant, you know, he really had the vision for it. So, you know, at the time I felt, I guess, a little uncomfortable with it. But having said that, I was into it. You know, it's Peter's great to work with. There's a lot of his energy, especially in the drums and stuff on that track. And you know, it has that crazy middle-8 section. I always love the video that we did for that track as well. You know?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that. You know, I've been going through a huge 10cc meets Godley Creme fanboy phase this year. So I've been sitting around listening to a lot of their albums, like the brilliant L album and some of the others. And then, you know, they became, you know, they were kind of guys that thought outside the box musically. And then when they made videos, they carried that over because it was almost like they all wanted to be movie makers anyway. And a lot of 10cc music is inspired by old films and such. So I was curious what it was like working with them. And was that like done on a sound stage? Did they like build that kind of wood looking backdrop? And
they did. Yeah.
Okay. Well, tell us where was that done and what was it like working with those guys?
Somewhere in London, you know, I forget exactly where, you know, in some fairly cold, you know, it wasn't Shepperton, but it sort of felt like that sort of place.
Right.
Yeah. So they built this wooden box basically, you know, and then the brief was, you know, they set up a microphone and said to me, sing it, we're going to record you singing it like 8 times, I think it was, and just try not to move, try not to smile, try just to hold the same expression, you know. So that's what I did, and then some poor guy had to then cut those 8 takes, you know, just like literally physically cut the tape. I think there was some new technology they had to do that, but I wouldn't have wanted to be that guy to do the editing on that video.
Yeah, I mean, that's really where the magic came from that. You know, they basically made it into 2-second clips and then quickly splice between them. And, you know, nobody had ever seen anything quite like that before. It was really a lot of fun to watch, you know.
I guess the video we were all in love with at the time was Peter Gabriel's Sledgehammer video.
Oh, sure.
It was a sort of stop motion type thing, you know. So we all wanted that kind of look, you know. But they had that particular tape was a very original take, I think, and it was, videos in those days were, I guess, when you're the artist, there's a lot of, you're just sitting around, there's a lot of hurry up and wait, so my memory of that shoot is a lot of sitting around and then some intense activity and then a lot more sitting around.
Who were all the extras?
Baseball.
Were they just people that they rounded up, the extra musicians that are playing, or were they people
some
that
were
you knew?
friends. We had Saida Garrett's singing on the track, isn't she? So I think a couple of them were people that we were using in a sort of live band when we were doing TV stuff at the time, and they probably brought along their friends, So it certainly wasn't a kind of a band that we were working with all the time.
Right. Well, it's become quite the classic, and I guess it was just what the doctor ordered at the time for you guys.
Just what we needed, yeah.
Did that feel like it kind of catapulted you into the next level, pretty much, the next year or two?
Next level, yeah. I think there's always this interesting evolution with bands, you begin playing in little clubs in London, and you assemble a bunch of, friends, fans, people that follow you around a bit, do you know what I mean? And you do an album, they love it, but you then have to go up to the next level. And I think especially when we went up to the level of Everybody Have Fun Tonight, your old fans, who liked our very first Wang Chung album, which was quite a sort of indie sounding record. Well, I'm no doubt sort of shocked and dismayed by us sounding like, a party band, But you got to ride the horse the way it's going, and it's not like we were dragged kicking and screaming into it at all. We were into that whole thing, and the Mosaic album, I think, has some interesting work on it, some good tracks. There's
one thing I noticed going from Points on I've been surveying your work recently, and I know Points on the Curve was almost a minimalist Eno-ish way with some of the synth sequencing, etc., and then Mosaic really broadened the instrumental palette to horns, more guitars, more intricate drum patterns, etc. So and that continued in the warmer in the next one. So it was
I guess a lot to do with
what's that?
Yeah, a lot to do with working with different producers. So Chris Hues and Ross Cullen did Points on the Curve. Chris is naturally a much more sort of minimalist thinker. He's not a sort of player. He's he's a drummer, amazing drummer, but he's not someone who can sit down at the piano and kind of buzz through things in the way that Peter can. And Peter really wanted to play on the records as well. And Peter naturally hears horn lines and hears a big production and. And I think also the technology had progressed even in that short couple of years, from using Fairlights with Chris and Ross, which were frankly pretty awful sounding machines. I mean, the promise of them was great, but they were very sort of tinny sounding samples. I think they were 8-bit. I know God knows what 16K or something. It was like, but yeah, and then we were using a synclavier with Peter, which was frankly an amazing sounding machine, really good. And,
much better. Zappa used that extensively.
Yeah.
And did a number of albums back then, and even used it on stage at times where they would just trigger it and play and react to it. Yeah. Was Peter's involvement with Zappa something that made you want him as a producer?
It was, yeah. And certainly for Nick, Nick is a massive Frank Zappa head, more so than I am. So Nick was very much like, Peter's amazing and we need him on board, So, that was very much part of it.
Right.
I remember in your article that you wrote for the Canterbury book, I don't want to get too far ahead, where you talk about Canterbury music, which isn't really, it's more about the Canterbury artists, but there was a combination between scatological 12-year-old juvenile humor and very serious musical compositions there, and Zappa personified that.
Absolutely, yeah. No, he was very much doing that, in a way that few American artists ever dared do. That more whimsical thing was very much part of the Canterbury thing, and I guess played out into all sorts of English pastoral prog stuff, around the sort of what should we say, 67, 68 through to 75, maybe 65 to 75, that sort of decade, really. You know. But yeah, you're absolutely right. That sort of whimsicality was in Zappa and the Canterbury scene, and this strong jazz influence as well.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Yeah.
You know, I love that kind of dichotomy, you know, these
Yeah.
crazy, silly lyrics meets very serious music.
Yeah.
Or kind of the other way around, you know, these kind of bands like Steely Dan or 10cc is another example where the music is very nice, but the lyrics are very snarky. You know,
Yes.
it's like, it's an interesting combination.
No, it is. Yeah,
you had mentioned the book, so why don't we segue into talking about how the book
Sure.
came together and the Canterbury Sound and whether or not it exists. And I guess I should let folks know that you would live in Canterbury. And so I was wondering if you could kind of fill us in a bit about, you know, just where the boundaries of Canterbury are and what it's like just living there at this in this day and age.
Well, geographically, it's about 65 miles from the centre of London, due southeast. So heading towards the Channel ports, you know, so for me, it's a half-an-hour drive down to the coast, you know, to get on a ferry to go to Europe, or it was up until about 6 months ago. You know, now we can't get off this island because of the pandemic, you know, and also nobody can come into it because of the pandemic and because of Brexit. So it's all a bit of a sorry mess, you know. But the theory of Canterbury still pertains, you know, which is it's like an hour from London and 2 hours from Paris, basically, you know. So it's and that's quite important in, you know, the musical element of the Canterbury scene, because I think there is this cosmopolitan thing to it, you know, although you wouldn't particularly notice that if you came and visited Canterbury. But the history of it is of a place of pilgrimage, you know. So the centre of Canterbury is still the cathedral. The cathedral is the sort of, if you like, the mother church of the Church of England, which is like covers the whole country, you know. It's an incredible Gothic cathedral, and it's, yeah, as Joseph Campbell said, it's a sort of spiritual landscape, whatever your particular leaning spiritually might be. You know, there's people have been standing in that space for many hundreds, sometimes I think maybe many thousands of years, actually, in this sort of area of England, you know, involved in religious pursuits and stuff. You know,
is Canterbury just considered the area, or is there a specific town called Canterbury there?
Yeah.
Now, are there any surrounding towns that are also part of this?
Yeah,
this area?
I guess Canterbury is a small city, so it's probably about I think it's about 60,000 people live here. You know, there's students as well. There's 2 universities, so the student population sort of makes it a much bigger place, bigger population when they're around. You know, yeah, but that's it really. It's just a small city in the countryside. It's got little villages sort of dotted around it.
Okay.
And yeah, but I guess one of the universities in particular that I taught at for a while, Canterbury Christchurch University, has a strong music tradition, you know, a sort of really thriving music department. And that has sort of supported the music scene, the more recent music scene in Canterbury to a large degree. Certainly it produces a lot of interesting musicians, you know. And so I guess I moved to Canterbury about 20 years ago out of London, and partly because my daughter was going to school here in Canterbury, and it just made a lot of sense practically to be here. She started having piano lessons when she was still at school with this guy, Sam Bailey, who was a young student at Canterbury Christchurch University. But we were introduced to him as someone who was really sort of forward thinking, because my daughter Violet didn't really want to have kind of grey lessons particularly, you know, she just wanted to play creatively, and he really encouraged that. And I used to really like chatting to Sam after her lessons, because he talked about music I'd never heard of and artists I'd never heard of, and was very connected up with the local scene, you know. And so when she went off to university, I said to Sam, just keep coming round, and you know, let's just have a glass of wine and play through some monk or something, you know. And this was at a time when I was really getting super interested in jazz and wanted to explore it by playing it rather than just listening to it, you know. And then that gradually grew into us playing with some other musicians, me writing some stuff, principally because I could write things in E instead of everything being in B flat and E flat and all those difficult jazz keys. You know? And so we sort of started making this sort of jazzy, and when I started writing my own stuff, sort of jazzy, proggy music, I suppose. And I think I say in the essay in the book, you know, we did a few gigs. It was all pretty low level, but it was all low level and pretty local in Canterbury. But I sent some stuff to Chris Hues, who I remained friends with from, you know, Points on the Curve and everything. And also Chris and I worked together in the 90s doing a bit of producing together. And so I sent some of the stuff we were doing to Chris, and he said, "Oh, this is great. Come down to Bath. Let's do an album. I want to sort of start a little label. I want to do interesting things." So we got this incredible opportunity to work with Chris as a producer, you know. And Chris is one of those guys who I think always gets more out of musicians. When Chris is in the room, I know that I always play better. It's not like I'm necessarily consciously trying harder, but I know the bar is higher. So he's just a great person to have around. And in the mixing process with that album, I just remember him listening to one of the tracks and going, "Oh, this is so Canterbury, this track," you know. And I was like, "What do you mean? It's, you know, I wrote it in Canterbury." He went, "No, Canterbury Sound. You know all about that?" And I was like, "No, I don't." You know, so he made me up this CD, and I'd heard of some of the bands like Soft Machine, Caravan, Hatfield and the North, but I hadn't really listened to them, explored them, you know. And so I had this CD, and I was driving from Canterbury down to Bath, which is a sort of 3.5 hour drive, you know. And I really started to get into this stuff. You know, I remember there's a band called Egg and this great track called A Visit to Newport Hospital.
Yes.
And, you know, that was really inspiring. The Hatfield and the North stuff was really inspiring, you know. And of course, the Soft Machine stuff, Facelift, you know. And from there, you know, it was like getting into Soft Machine 3, you know, that, and then 4, 5, 6, the sort of heavier jazz things that they did, you know. Well, it goes on and on, you know, very into Robert Wyatt's stuff as well, you know. But it opened up this whole area of music that I was vaguely aware of, but I never knew that it all coalesced around this notion of Canterbury as the center of it, you know. So it's fascinating, very fascinating.
It was such an honor for me when I was co-running Nearfest. We had the first Caravan show in the U.S. in 27 years. They had last toured the U.S. in 1975, and we flew them over for 2002. I'm going to share my screen to tell this oddball story. So they have an album that came out soon after that Nearfest trip called The Unauthorized Breakfast Item. You could see the lunch lady bringing this unauthorized. Anyway, so so at that hotel for Nearfest, it was right next to the concert venue. There were 2 levels of the breakfast buffet. There was the regular breakfast buffet, which was $9, and there was the special breakfast buffet, which was $19. And if you bought the regular breakfast buffet, you got a red ticket. The other, you got a green ticket. So I see Caravan there, and I'm like, wow, this is Caravan. So I'm, you know, chatting them, talking with them about the fest. They were just so happy to be there. You know, people are eating breakfast. Jeff Richardson, the violist, comes down, and I'm like, yeah, let's get some breakfast. So we're loading up our plates at the regular breakfast, and he reaches over and he grabs an apple. And this lady who was, you know, large, just came running out. She goes, no, that's an unauthorized breakfast item. $10 extra. And he goes, this is an apple. And he goes, it's an unauthorized breakfast item. He goes, okay, I can put it back. No, you can't do that, right? Because of the health laws. So he has to have this apple and an extra $10. And then she comes back to the table and she saw all these other apple cores. And she's like, those are unauthorized breakfast items. So I'm like, all right, guys, I'm going to pay this. So I take my credit card out and pay the extra fee. And it turns into their album title. And they have this whole saga about the missing piece of fruit. So that was crazy. It was like a Monty Python sketch in real life. It was totally ridiculous. So,
and I can imagine those guys just being, you know, really finding it funny and sort of scary at the same time.
Absolutely. Pi Hastings, and you know, sitting there having a drag with David Sinclair after the show. And then we had Hatfield in the North come in 2007, and they actually approached us. And so I'm sitting at my home and I get a phone call, and it was somebody with this deepest, most mellifluous British accent. It's like, oh my God, this is Richard Sinclair on the phone.
Okay.
So he's asking me if we could have Hatfield in the North. They tried to get Dave Stewart to participate, but he didn't. They had a deputy for him. But yeah, it was such a treat having those legends come to the States and perform for us. Sean was at several of those events. So.
Yeah. No, it's great that you would organize a festival that would cater to that sort of taste and stuff, you know, because
it's sold out every year except one.
Such important music.
It was
and
such variety
on as well, you know, and it's a really interesting arena, you know, and I guess it's really since well, I guess, you know, doing the album with Tony, you know, was a sort of venture into an era, you know. I mean, Genesis were a band that I adored when I was, you know, in my teens, and so it was an incredible honor to be asked to do that record, you know. But that sort of connected up in a way with this magazine in the UK called Prog magazine, you know, which is again a very wide-ranging magazine, but you know, just defined by the prog
great
arena.
magazine and great people running it.
Yeah, really great. Jerry's such a great guy, you know, but really enthusiast, you know. But they gave me an award back in 2019, I think it was. The Outer Limits Award, you know, which is for someone who, you know, was doing sort of essentially mainstream stuff and has now ventured into more what should we say? Interesting. No, that's the wrong word, isn't it? But challenging areas. Yeah,
the word applies. It's apt.
Yeah.
You remind me of Bill Bruford in a way, because he joined National Health, which was a Canterbury band.
Yes.
And they had lost Pip Pyle to another group, and Bill sat in, and he's like, "Oh, this is a great. You know, he could explore. He could get more into the jazz he wanted to do." And they had to take a vote on whether it was okay to have someone who had a #1 hit record in their band. So it seems like that you followed a similar path.
I can certainly see that. I can certainly see that being something to vote on. Yeah. But yeah, Bill, what great. And that way that he straddles prog and jazz, and his autobiography, I think, is a really great read, actually.
I have to read that. I have to get that.
Yeah, he makes very amusing distinctions between working with Yes and working with, you know, Chick Corea and stuff. You know, yeah.
Well, he's very modest too. I mean, there's certain people are like, you know, who would you like to work with? And he's like, well, you know, I'd love to work with Joe Zawinul, but I don't think I could cut it. You know, he needs he needs guys from a different level.
No, I mean, he's a very realistic guy, and an incredible musician as well.
Yeah,
Incredible.
I mean, pretty much everything he's been involved with is progressive rock gold.
No, it totally is.
You know, and even his fusion band, which was kind of straddled the line between prog and fusion in a way that I really haven't heard any other group do.
Yeah.
And he took Dave Stewart from his National Health gig, the Canterbury band, in with him to explore, because he said Dave Stewart was, I think, one of the most harmonically complex keyboard players he'd ever heard.
Yeah, no, I can get that. Yeah,
absolutely right. But you know, another one that I think gets up there is Tony Banks. You know, there's really nothing like Tony's chordal approach. It's so rich and sophisticated, and that was what I noticed when I heard the Strictly Inc. album. Was I mentioned this to you before, Jack, that it kind of reminded me of Duke, because there's you know, Duke is full of lots of beautiful piano work, and so is Strictly Inc. So I was curious, how did you hook up with Tony to make that album, and what was it like?
Essentially, after Wang Chung split, I did a solo album for Columbia Records, and I used a producer called Nick Davis, who they just recommended to me, I think. But I met with Nick, and I liked him because he was very quick, and I guess I just wanted to. I felt I was in the sort of worst my worst frame of mind, where I really thought I knew what I wanted and how to get it, you know. And I did it, this solo album, and I mean, it never came out, and I've never released it. Probably because it's too painful to sort of to think about it, really. But anyway, through working with Nick was working on all the Genesis remasters and stuff at the time, and Tony, as he periodically does, had come up with enough stuff to make a solo album and was casting around for a singer, and Nick suggested me, and so I went down to the farm, met with Tony, sang a couple of tracks, and he was just really into it, and I ended up writing some lyrics for him as well. And yeah, and we really hit it off. And I still see Tony. I went to see him last year, actually, during the little break in the lockdown. He's got this fabulous house down in the countryside, sort of due south of London, and incredible garden, like the sort of garden that you read about in the, you know, Vita Sack West and all those, Virginia Woolf, those sort of people who cultivated these great gardens, and he and his wife look after it. It's just, you talk about ultimate Englishness, you know, that's what you really experience with Tony, I think.
Oh yeah, you can hear it in the music too.
You really can.
Very much.
Yeah.
Well, I love that record. You know, it was kind of the record I hope Genesis would have made in the 90s, but they so, you know, it kind of scratched that itch that
I felt that it's sort of you know, Peter Gabriel Genesis, you know, I still really love those, you know, Foxtrot, Selling by the Pound especially. I think are immaculate prog pieces, you know, or Genesis records really, you know, and and I think Tony does hark back to that, really. You know, he's writing in that sort of style, and so yeah, it's a shame that for whatever reason it doesn't just merge with that taste that Genesis fans have, you know, for that kind of music. You know, I'm never quite sure. It's always very interesting to me, you know, when you, like me, doing solo records rather than Wang Chung records, you know, and you know, that it's a very different thing that you're selling, although the music has distinct similarities, you know. And
well, I can definitely hear that. Like, it's a hark back to Points on the Curve and the minimalism a bit on Primitif.
Yeah.
I was wondering if the album title itself has something to do with the more stripped down Robert Wyatt kind of, you know, singing with important but less overt musical backdrop.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I recorded that album all in a little apartment I was living in Canterbury at the time. I was sort of living on my own for various reasons. Yeah, so it was, yeah, just like a couple of microphones, some couple of guitars, a computer, and some things to plug it all together, you know. So not at all like the sort of studio recordings that I previously made. Although I think I've been sort of getting back to recording stuff in my house and stuff with some of the jazz, in inverted commas, stuff that I'd done before Primitif. So there was an album before that I did, really half an album actually, because it's just one side of a vinyl pressing that we made. But we did a cover of a tune by Beck called Nobody's Fault But My Own. And working in Canterbury, one of the new Canterbury bands of note is a band called Syd Arthur. I don't know whether you've
opened for Yes.
Yeah, I saw them open for Yes.
Exactly right.
Going on about 10 years ago now, I guess.
Yeah. Well, they're a band based in Canterbury, and really talented guys, you know. And I ended up sort of doing work with them. And there's like a Canterbury sort of like new music festival that was going on. And each year they would say to me, do something, you know, just write something, you know. So I got this idea to do a sort of jam, really, you know, between my jazz group, which had a very filigree jazz drummer, a guy called Mark Holub. So, you know, you never get Mark to play a straight, you know, backbeat sort of thing. And an amazing double bass player called Loran Donan. They are the rhythm section in a band called Lead Bib. I don't know if you've ever come across them.
Yeah, they're kind of an avant jazz.
Yeah, very
avant. Released on Cuneiform Records, which is
exactly
a label, a very good friend of mine. Yeah.
So they played in Canterbury a bit. Sam was working with them a bit. You know, that very avant-garde thing. Sam is very into free jazz. You And so we were working together on various things, and then Syd Arthur were kind of around. So I said, well, why don't we just do this gig and do a cover of Facelift, which we did, do Nobody's Fault But My Own. And yeah, we also did something from the Stravinsky Violin Concerto as well. It's like classic Canterbury, eclectic, semi-serious, semi-difficult, you know. And that gig went really well. And so a few months later, the opportunity arose to record Nobody's Fault But My Own. And we recorded it live just basically in a garage, like in this house that one of the guys in Syd Arthur was renting. And so yeah, we got as many mics as we could and set it all up, and had the 2 drummers and 2 bass players. Chris Hues came down actually and sat and listened and played a bit of egg. and we had an amazing saxophone player called Paul Booth sitting with us as well. Paul Booth is pretty local to here as well, but I think just incredible player, you know. And yeah, we did 3 or 4 takes of this track, and then Joel and I spent a bit of time editing the takes together. And yeah, Nobody's Fault But My Own. It's on Spotify and the digital platforms. Jack Hues and the quartet and Syd Arthur. I think it comes up under my name. It's worth checking out. So it's a sort of 25-minute jam on this Beck tune, which I've always loved, and I'm very inspired by sort of Electric Miles, I suppose, you know.
Oh yeah, love it.
Yeah, so yeah, it's definitely worth checking out. I think very Canterbury in its way, probably the most Canterbury thing I ever did in many ways.
It is. I've heard it, and I thought it was really unique. So check it out, folks.
Yeah,
you mentioned that in your book chapter about one of the hallmarks of the sound is, rather than a plodding rock beat, is the filigree on the cymbals, hi-hats, etc., filling that high-end space in interesting ways on the record.
Yeah. No, it's an interesting thing to sort of talk about, you know, this Canterbury sound, you know, if it did exist. You know, what is it? I mean, how do you identify it? You know? Certainly that's one of the characteristics, the sort of jazz thing in the rhythms, you know. And I think also, you know, no guitars. I mean, I know Hatfields and especially Caravan, you know, have guitars and stuff, but they don't have kind of strong sort of rock guitars exactly, you know. And things tend to be much more based around keyboards, and particularly Hammond organ, you know, which is obviously the characteristic of Soft Machine, you know, that they don't have guitars. It's sort of Hammond organ, bass and drums in many ways, you know. And so yeah, very, very fascinating, all of that stuff, you know. And I guess, you know, writing this book, it sort of made me think, you know, how much of what I do is in any way legitimately Canterbury, even though I do live here, you know. And I guess there's you know, the jazz progressive thing is certainly part of it. But I think my way with guitars and the way I sing as well almost sort of takes it out of Canterbury, you know, identifiably, you know, because I guess I'm so kind of American influenced actually in the way that I approach those things, whereas the Canterbury thing is very much to reserve almost pristine Englishness around the vocals and the way that guitars are delivered within a track.
I think the guitars have a very jazz approach. You know, somebody like Phil Miller, you know, his approach is straight up jazz. And, you know, and I think that's one of the reasons that it kind of adds kind of a delightful layer to the proceedings. You know, it's like there's a certain whimsical quality to the vocals and even to the music at times, and the guitar's right there with it. So it's a great combination.
Absolutely. Yeah.
One time, several people would always ask me, you know, because I've lived this double life of prog rock impresario and university uniprof, and was like, so what is this prog rock? And I said, well, you imagine a triangle with jazz at one corner, one vertex, rock at one, and classical at the other. And if it's in the triangle, there you go. And you know, Canterbury might be more towards the jazz and the rock side of things. One thing you mentioned is that it doesn't quite have a lot of that classical romantic era backdrop that, you know, of a Rick Wakeman or even a Genesis. They don't quite have that. So it's maybe more tucked towards the jazz and the rock. And that is what qualifies it in this really broad genre.
Yeah, no, I would say that's right. You know, the jazz thing, I think especially with Soft Machine and with Robert Wyatt's work generally, you know, it has that sort of subtlety in a sense that the jazz rhythms have, you know.
Yeah, like a nimbleness to it that, you know, some of the more, you know, Sturm und Drang, yes, or ELP just doesn't have it all.
Exactly right. Yeah,
it's like a grace to it that really sets it apart.
And
sets your music apart. I mean, that sense of grace is all over Primitif, all over both sides of it. It's really beautiful and understated in a powerful way. So.
Yeah. I'm really pleased with Primitif. You know, I did it pretty spontaneously. You know, I wasn't planning on making an album at that time particularly, but you know, I had a lot of time, you know, going through the winter, as it were, with this discontent, and you know, the music just kept coming. I think sometimes as a writer, you know, I'm not sure I believe in writer's block, but I definitely believe that sometimes the well's dry and there's really nothing much to say, and other times it's very full, you know, and I think it's also related to sort of like emotional stuff as well, and I've been through quite a lot of that in the years leading up to Primitif, so there was a lot to release in a sense, you know. And having done the follow-up to it, which I think is maybe a little more, I think it's probably sounds a bit better and a bit more focused somehow, you know. I was sort of thinking, yeah, Primitif was good, you know, but probably quite dark and difficult, you know. And I played a bit of it a couple of evenings ago, and was really blown away by it, actually, which is probably not, you shouldn't really say that about your own music, but I thought, wow, yeah, this is a good bit of work, you know. It's very intense and very focused on what I was going through at the time, and I think very honest as well. And I think that title, you know, Primitif, is partly to do with the means of production of the album, but it's also partly to do with the rawness of the emotions, and I think emotions that human beings have been going through for many, many years, you know, to do with loss and to do with sort of facing up to, you know, looking at the, where are we? You know, well, I'm in my 60s now, you know, so you're looking at life in a different way to the way you were looking at it when you were in your 20s and 30s.
Absolutely. Could you tell us a bit about Whitstable Beach? That's one of my favorite tracks.
Yeah. So musically, the idea I had for that, and I remember just sitting in this living room on the back of a settee, kind of with this sense that the rhythm would just be going ding, 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 with no perceptible sense of time signature or where the one was, you know, and that the melody, and I got the melody almost instantly, would just sort of float over the top of it, almost at a much slower pace, you know. And I guess I've done that a bunch of times with my writing. There's a song called Wait on Points on the Curve, which has a similar approach. It's got a very fast backing track. The drums and everything are moving fast, but the chords are moving very slowly, you know, and you get this sort of double speed thing going on. So Whitstable Beach is a variant of that approach. Yeah, and then it was sort of like, yeah, when I started recording it, it was, I think I recorded it just on acoustic guitar first and kind of performed it, you know, without figuring out where the downbeat was, you know. I just recorded it to a click probably so that I could do the timing, you know. And then there's obviously this sort of middle section. It sounds like it's a chorus, but it's not really, where the drums go into 4, but really they're in 6/4 rather than 4/4, you know. So, I mean, I don't think about all this before I write and while I'm writing, but looking back on it, that's what I was doing. I was trying to keep it all musically a little, like a lot of tension and a kind of off balance thing, you know.
Yeah.
And then Whitstable is a little town about 5 miles north of Canterbury, on the coast, on the river estuary, and yeah, somewhere where when we first moved here, I used to take my kids up there, and you know, like after school, sometimes we'd get some fish and chips and just sit on the beach. And all of those things I talk about, there's this bit of the beach where it's at low tide. It sort of, the beach kind of stretches right out in a sort of peninsula. You know, I think it used to be like in medieval times, like a sort of landing ground for boats or something, you know, like a little or quite a big jetty, you know, for unloading stuff, you know. But it's the remains of that. And then as the tide comes in, it sort of disappears. So there's that stuff in the lyrics about, you know, my will, as it were, is like this jetty stretching out into the water, and the tide comes in there all the time, covers it, and you know, so it's that sort of struggle. So the lyrics are sort of are about the geography of the place in a sense, you know, but using that as a metaphor for the kind of the difficulties I was experiencing at the time.
Okay, I see. Well, I was curious about the location.
Yes. Yeah.
What inspired the Dusty Springfield cover, The Look of Love?
Yeah. I've always loved that song.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, you know, I started learning guitar when I was 8 years old, and my dad was a jazz musician, played saxophone, you know, and he had a dance band, a local dance band in the town I was brought up in. From about the age of 12, I was playing in that band with him. He had me along playing sort of bass guitar. It was an incredible training, really, you know, with my dad. On the one hand, I sort of had this difficult relationship with him because I was never quite sure what he thought. He was a very silent person, so he would never go, you know, that's amazing, you know. He could just say nothing, basically, you know. But on the other hand, you know, what's more great than your dad wanting to have you in his band playing in front of his mates and stuff, you know, and you know, so you know, he really did support me hugely in that way, you know. So he was playing all this. It was like an old-fashioned dance hall, and he would play, you know, waltzes and foxtrots and all these kind of things, you know, for like sort of ballroom dancing type people, you know. I'm sure Dance All Days, in fact, you know, is all connected up with those experiences. But one of the songs he played that I loved was The Look of Love. And that just sort of stayed with me. And then more recently, it sort of came up a few times in a slightly sort of romantic context. And I got into this idea of trying to do a cover of it, but where it would just sort of like go off into this sort of like almost surreal set of chord changes and stuff, you know. So essentially what happens is I do a pretty straight version of the song with all due respect to the song, you know, because I think it's an amazing bit of craftsmanship as songwriting, you know. And then as it sort of settles down, I sort of keep changing the gears all the time with the harmony and moving it off into different places and taking it into this slightly sort of minimalist, sort of Steve Reich kind of thing, you know. And in fact, if you listen to the live version of it, all of those chord changes, I wanted to try and perform it like I saw Steve Reich performing the music for 18 musicians, you know, where all of the changes, the harmonic changes, are done on the nod. So the musicians play a sort of section and they keep repeating it, and then somebody goes and they change to the next thing, you know. So I was trying to do that with the end of The Look of Love, that these chord sequences would, you know, keep changing, and then eventually it gets to a bit where I've completely reharmonized the chorus and it goes somewhere else, you know. And on Primitif, putting it first was really this idea that it was a sort of portal to come out of the real world of song, if you like, into my world of kind of complicated and sort of it's reasonably challenging songwriting, you know, this much more personalized world that I wanted to bring you into. A bunch of people said to me, you know, why don't you start with one of your own songs and leave that till a bit later? But I get that. I always wanted The Look of Love to start it. It was like a sort of totemic kind of song in many ways, and I wanted you to have this journey, like I say, from the real world into this my own world, you know.
Okay, excellent. So I'm going to skip around a little bit here.
Sure.
I saw your recent remaking of Everybody Have Fun Tonight with the orchestra. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And I got to say, your voice has held up so beautifully over the years. I was wondering if you have any regimen that you go through to kind of keep your pipes in shape, or any tips for other singers?
I think the regimen is really not singing that much. Actually, you know, I think because I haven't toured, you know, my whole life every summer for 6 months, sort of, you know, out on the road, but it's remained, you know, a reasonably flexible instrument, you know. And
now, am I right that on the new version everything is fresh. There's no,
Yes.
you didn't take anything from the original and drop it in. It's, I mean, vocally.
We did do a remake of Everybody Have Fun Tonight back in 2005, I think, you know, and the very high bit of On the Edge of Oblivion.
Yeah, that bridge is so high.
So
Wonderful.
we did slightly cheat on that, but everything else is brand new. Yeah. I just can't get up there anymore. But everything else is new. You know.
Well, I've heard you kind of reharmonize it nowadays, and I still think it sounds great.
When I do it live, I sing it down a fourth or whatever.
I like the remake to encourage people to distance and be safe during this annus horribilis of the pandemic.
No, that was fun to do. And again, I re-sang it again for that performance. And
I liked how you got some other 80s pop stars like David Sterry from Real Life. Little shot in there. It's so fun.
No, that was nice, and it was nice to do it for the I can't remember the name of the charity now, but they were helping the sort of medical staff, and all the proceeds were going to that, you know, as medics who sort of like on site for some of this dreadful COVID stuff, you know. So so that was really great to do.
I love the nod to the original video, the whole 2-second frame kind of thing going on again.
We worked with a really great guy on that.
That's probably really easy to do nowadays, you know.
He's saying Armando, his name is so much easier to do these days than that poor guy who did it for you back in the 80s.
You said basically the chorus came first. It wasn't like that catchy bass line bomb, but dun 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 dun.
No,
you know, that almost reminds me of the middle of All Right Now from Free. Similar kind of mixolydian, and the bass player plays that solo, you know.
Very, very similar. In fact, it's probably the same, isn't it?
It's the way it's tucked in, you don't really notice it. Vocals.
No, absolutely.
But I was curious, what kind of bands did you tour with back in the 80s? And did you feel like any of them were your contemporaries?
Yeah, well, in the first big tour we did in '84, which was supporting Dancehall Days and Points on the Curve, was the Cars. And they were on their Heartbeat City tour, and basically they had a huge hit with Drive because of the Live Aid exposure that song got. And so we were on this tour with them, you know, playing enormous sort of 80,000 people a night type stadium gigs, you know. But it was great for us because Dancehall Days was a proper hit, so people were interested to come and see us, you know. So sometimes when you go and see the support act at a stadium gig, you know, the place is literally, you know, empty, you know, apart from a few diehard type people, you know. But we were playing to pretty full houses every night, you know, and got an amazing response, you know. I mean, we were very eager, young British guys, do you know what I mean, trying to make a good impression. And for better or worse, I remember the Cars had this policy of playing a song and then turning their backs on the audience and not talking to the audience, you know. It was like a sort of artsy,
kind of Miles Davis almost.
but sort of en masse, and the effect on the audience was devastating because you just felt people got very disincentivized to applaud, you know.
That's a bit of a Miles Davis trick.
Well, right. With Miles, you sort of expected it, I think, you know, but with those guys in a stadium, I don't think it worked. You know?
A pop band, it's like, what are you guys doing? You know?
I mean, I get, you know, striking a bit of a pose is important, but anyway, sort of the collateral was positive for us because I think people felt, wow, Wang Chung were great, you know, and Cars are a bit boring, you know. And I mean, they weren't at all boring. They were using 2 synclaviers. They were like really reproducing the stuff beautifully, you know, and great performances, you know. But as I say, they had this slightly self-destructive approach to the
detached.
Exactly.
Who did you tour with for Mosaic?
With Mosaic, it was Tina Turner.
Wow. That must have been
amazing.
Huge show.
I'm not sure that it was a great match, really, but then I don't know what opening act would have been a great match for her, especially in those days. You know?
Yeah, really.
So really at the top of her game, you know. Yeah. And but that again, very big stadiums, huge audiences. And
do you have any MTV-esque memories to share? Did you guys go to the Video Music Awards or did you get stuck on any of those? Did you get? Were you on the package tour with Milli Vanilli back in the day?
No, we didn't any of that stuff. But we did get invited to the first MTV Music Awards, which were at Radio City Music Hall, and I recall that sort of, you know, as a series of disjointed flashbacks sort of thing. But I do remember, because we were up for Best Video, I think, with Dance All Days. Peter Gabriel's Sledgehammer won. I think that was that year that it was all, you know. And I think that I sort of decided, yeah, obviously that's going to win, you know. But there was a moment I remember sitting there with Nick and Darren, thinking like, God, what happens if we do win? Because none of us are prepared a speech or kind of any kind of acceptance, you know, and the audience is full of all these luminaries. But I suppose in that context, fortunately, we didn't win, so I didn't have to say that.
You would have had to do what Alex Lifeson did when Rush was inducted into the Hall of Fame, and he was asked to give his speech. He didn't have anything, so he just literally said, blah, 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 and then he walked off.
For 5 minutes, his bandmates were about to crawl under a rock. You know, it was kind of his middle finger towards the typical customs, I suppose.
Well, good for him.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the song Winter, because that's the song on Primitif that seems to have hit me the most.
Okay.
And it catches the mood of, you know, walking along the English moors in the dead of winter with some slush under your feet and a bit of discomfort, but there's beauty also amidst the discomfort. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that piece.
So that's sort of started as an acoustic thing, and I think at the time, in the evenings, I would listen to, I'd sort of just got myself Spotify basically, and I was trawling through all the sort of back catalogs, you know, the classical back catalog. You know, classical music is, in part, it's to do with the pieces themselves, you know, so Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, you know, is Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. And you think, yeah, a nice modern recording of it, it's going to be great, you know, but you soon start to realize that actually older recordings are sometimes more interesting, and certainly they carry the spirit of a certain time with them, you know. So recordings made of Beethoven's Fifth, say in the 1940s in Berlin by the Berlin Philharmonic, are very dark and kind of portentous things, you know. Made in Vienna in the 70s have a kind of very powerful energy. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. Classical music is about the sort of performances as much as it is about the piece. And I started listening a lot to recordings of Schubert's song cycle Winterreise. So Franz Schubert was writing in the, born in 1792 and died in 1828, I think. Maybe that's not quite right, but anyway, something like that. And he's born in 1798 and died in 1828. That's it, because he was just over 30 when he died. Incredible. And he wrote towards the end of his life this set of 24 songs called Winterreise, or The Winter's Journey, which is this sort of poet realizing that his love affair with this woman is over, and that he's got to sort of leave the village that he's in, and he sort of trudges off into the snow, and it's a sort of metaphor for death, essentially, you know. But I started listening to all sorts of different recordings, and Winter, in a sense, is very influenced. In fact, I sing about my winter's journey in that song, and although musically it's in a very different place from the Schubert, it's similarly informed when you talk about that trudging across the moors with the slush under your feet. It's kind of that thing. But I think, again, what I was trying to do was to get the influence of Steve Reich's music for 18 musicians into a place where it would work within a sort of pop song, rock song context, you know. So there's a sort of central section. The song's in G minor, and it drops into a sort of E minor section where it's just sort of pulsing tones again. And again, I wanted to have that sort of freedom in the pulse that Steve Reich gets as well. And then it sort of goes into a sort of end section. So again, I was trying to, in that piece, compose in a creative and a way that I'd not really heard anybody else do before, and I wasn't sure completely what I was doing. But it was sort of trying to land the song again in this Steve Reich place, you know. So, and also using this idea of taking a line and repeating it lyrically, you know, rather than having verse and chorus, you know. So you get these almost like mantra-like repeats of the lines, which I was getting a lot from Bowie's Black Star album, you know, that he was similarly trying to write in a slightly more extended and progressive in the sense of each line of the song moves the song onto a new bit of thinking, if you know what I mean, rather than the block repetitions that you get in normal pop structures.
So, yeah, the Black Star. He had to cut that song off at 9:59 because at 10 minutes it would have become double price on Apple.
Okay.
I have a couple of questions in the chat room.
Yeah.
Our friend Kevin says, what was the most memorable gig you performed at? Anything pop to mind?
Just trying to think. There are many, but the one that always sticks in my mind is one that we did, I think probably in around about 2010 or 11, Wang Chung gig at Summerfest in Milwaukee. And I think it was this time in my life where I hadn't really done any Wang Chung stuff for a long time, you know, and we were doing these sort of summer tours. Anyway, so we were in this sort of fairly big tent, and we started playing, and I guess this tent was like around, you know, quarter full, something like. There's a few people sitting down the front, but mostly empty up the back, you know. And as we went on playing, it gradually filled up. And by the end, I think the last track we played was Dancehall Days, you know. It was packed, and the response for Dancehall Days was just incredible, like not exactly Beatlemania, do you know what I mean? But people really loved it. I think we played it really well. And I remember standing at the front of the stage, right in the middle, and taking the applause. And I think, you know, all the way through the 80s, probably those big tours we did, I didn't really know how to handle it. Do you know what I mean? How to handle the onslaught of appreciation, if you know what I mean. And I think at Summerfest, you know, I really was like, you know, a lot of people would almost die, you know, to have this experience, you know, to have this level of appreciation from an audience, you know, for a song that you did 30 years ago or whatever, you know. And so that was very moving and very profound for me. Yeah, so I really do remember that.
Excellent. You know, it just comes to mind, there is a 90s song by Yes. It's called The Calling. Have you ever heard it before?
Don't know.
No. Well, it uses the same 3 chords as Dance Hall Days. So check it out sometime. The
okay.
FCG kind of thing going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Another question. We touched on working with Tony Banks a little earlier, probably before my friend John hit the chat room, but could you share a couple more thoughts on working with Tony and, you know, what it was like?
Yeah. So Tony's really clear about what he wants and what he doesn't want as well, you know. But he's also open to new ideas. I remember writing a lyric for him one time. I can't remember what the song's called now, but it's about the song about the photograph. This sort of on this trope of, you know, I took a picture of you and I've got your soul, sort of thing, you know. And I think it was that song where he sort of said to me, I like the song, but I really don't like this line here. You know, could you change that or something? You know. And I started messing around with it and ended up using that line about 6 times in the song, and did the complete opposite of what he said, basically, you know. And he found that very amusing and liked it, you know. So there was a side of him that was very open, you know. And I also remember talking to because he had the Genesis road crew guys were around. We recorded his album at the farm, you know. And I was chatting to them about, you know, the old days and the Mellotrons and all the gear. And one of them said, look, you know, all Tony's old gear's in the barn. You know, we could set it up in the studio if you wanted, you know, and we could try some things. And I said, that would be so cool, you know, just to kind of have some real Watcher of the Skies Mellotron, do you know what I mean? Sure. On a track. And Tony really wasn't into it. You know, he was like, and I think for him, it was just all trauma, basically. You know, he said, you know, quite a lot of the gigs, you know, for a certain phase began with Watcher of the Skies, so it was him solo basically playing on these machines that had literally been rebuilt, you know, an hour before, you know, because they constantly broke down and certain notes didn't work, and you know, he said it was just such a miserable experience basically trying to recreate all this. So he was much happier with his Yamaha keyboard with a Mellotron sample on it, you know.
I can relate to that. When I was running Nearfest in 2003, we had a Swedish band called Angloguard, and they mixed symphonic progressive rock with Bartokian classical and Swedish folk, and it's beautiful. But they were analog purists, and they agreed to the contract. And they said, we have one condition. We need 3 Mellotrons in perfect working order. We hope it's no problem. So I'm like, oh my God. So it turns out there was a Yahoo internet board for Mellotron refurbishers. And somebody who was fairly local, and he had 2 of them in his basement that he had rebuilt. And he said, okay, we'll buy a 3rd. And he went to this old woman's house who had one from the early 70s they used it as a church organ substitute. And he said, well, after I cleaned the mouse nest out of it, I was able to build it. So we had 3 perfectly working Mellotron orders, one of which had been a mouse nest for about 3 decades.
Yeah, I want to go to the Mellotron church. That sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, it does. That's
Yeah,
pretty
that's
basic. Yeah.
The angle there, we're gonna frog it up. Who were some of your early vocal influences, Jack?
I guess David Bowie will be huge for me.
Sure.
You know? And that, I guess, a lot of that sort of punk stuff, you know, around 78. I'm trying to think. There was a certain way those guys, sort of Joe Strummer, even Johnny Rotten to a certain extent, would deliver a sort of aggressive vocal, but with a very English thing in their voice, you know. So that was there. But I think you know, Bowie was absolutely who I modelled myself on way too much to begin with, I think. But yeah, I gradually found myself. It probably took me a long time to find myself, actually. Even I might say, you know, fairly recently, that I've felt like I really own my voice, if you know what I mean.
Silly question. Did anyone back in the 80s ever mistake you for Sting?
They did, yeah.
I was going to say.
Yeah. I remember there was this very weird situation where there was a girl who was, when I lived in London, she thought I was Sting in a slightly sort of like totally neurotic kind of way, because obviously I wasn't, you know. But she was writing letters to me, which my wife amusingly intercepted every time, you know, and ended up really sort of telling her to go away. But yeah, so that was one. I was spared the extremes of that because Mel took care of it for me, basically.
Well, yeah, a couple.
I do remember another time being in Camden Market in London, do you know what I mean, where this guy sort of said, "Oh yeah, Sting was around." You know, I thought it was you. So sometimes it worked the other way around. I'd be quite amused to know how many times Sting got mistaken for me. So.
Have you ever met him before?
I never have, actually. No. Mm-hmm. There are people who know us both who say there's an uncanny sort of similarity.
You're both blonde tenors, so you know.
Yeah.
And you mentioned loving Genesis early on. Did you have a chance to see Genesis and Yes and some of those?
I saw Yes
back in the day.
Yeah, I saw Yes twice. Once when they were touring the Yes album, and once when they were touring Fragile. And so I was a real, like 14, 15, I think, when those tours were happening. Maybe
that must have been quite a mind blower at that age.
They were completely inspiring, yeah. And I still remember sitting in the darkened, it was in Chatham Central Hall. So it was like an old movie theatre, basically, you know, sort of pillars and stuff on a sort of ornate balcony. And I can remember sitting in the stalls and just seeing the red dots on the amplifiers and the hum of the amps and the roadies would run on, you know, all that classic sort of stuff, you know. And I think it was on the Fragile tour, they played Stravinsky's Firebird, the end of the Firebird.
That's their big opener on
exactly.
most tours. Yeah.
Yeah, and
occasionally they swap it out for Benjamin Britten's Guide to Young Person's Orchestra, but Firebird 75% of the time.
Yeah.
And
I think that sort of blew me away as much as anything, quite honestly.
you could just feel the tension ratchet up as the Firebird plays, you know.
Exactly. Yeah. No, it's just wonderful, and it's just hearing that loud, hearing music loud. And but they were brilliant. You know, they absolutely nailed those tracks. You know,
and they had a great sound even early on. You know, I think they toured with Iron Butterfly and fell in love with their PAs, so they bought it from them. And, you know, and then they decided, you know, okay, well, let's mic up the entire drum kit and run it through the PA. That was kind of new back in those days. And drummers, they were lucky if they got a couple just mics hanging over them.
Yeah.
So that was, you know, really dialed their sound in a way that I don't think many live groups were at the time. So, and I mean, that's a prime time to see them. I mean, Fragile doesn't really get any better than that.
Absolutely. Then you have Bill Bruford's signature snare hit with the rim through that mic. Wow.
It was incredible. And the Chris Squire's sound as well, I remember, was just so exciting. Do you know what I mean? It's like, and he's playing as well, you know, it's like, just as with all live music, you know, it's just got that sense of place and time. You're there in the place at that time, listening to it happening, and there's a resonance with the audience, and it was just electrifying, really incredible, you know.
Imagine.
Yeah.
Rob, so, any more questions, Rob?
Yeah, go ahead.
No, good. I've asked the questions I wanted to ask about Primitif. I wanted to keep Jack moving forward and thinking of his incredibly new creative work that might not be as widespread heard as your 80s work, but I think it's just brilliant. And you remember, you're an inspiration in that, you know, I'm facing my 60s soon, and you know, to remain a creative, lively, engaged presence, creating and reinventing. I think that's
exactly
fantastic.
Well, this is a good time in your life to do it, I think. Actually, you know, you sort of know enough to know better, kind of thing, and yet you've still got the energy and the focus, in a sense, to perform it and try and get it down on record. You know, I still love the whole process of recording and recorded artifacts as a thing. Still fascinate me totally, you know. So yeah.
Oh, I have a random thought. So a lot of the prog epics of, you know, early Genesis, early Tull, early Yes have been remixed to surround sound, and that opens up new vistas in hearing it, you know, with the consultation of the artist, etc. Stephen Wilson of Porcupine Tree and his own work does all that. Have you ever given any thought to doing any of your old work and surround sound for a new audience, and to hear it in new ways with all the production touches? I could imagine, especially Warmer Side of Cool and Mosaic, being incredibly fascinating in that format.
They're pretty dense records in many ways, so yeah, it could be interesting to do that. You know, I was thinking as well, you know, To Live and Die in LA, although that's again quite a minimalist sort of palette in a way, because it was just Nick and myself and a drum machine doing all of that stuff, you know. But I think, sort of surround sound mixes of some of these albums could be really interesting. Yeah,
bring it on.
There was a story of Robert Fripp giving the master tapes very gingerly to Stephen Wilson to record to redo in the Court of the Crimson King in surround sound, and Stephen spent about 6 months on it, and he invited Robert to his studio, and he started it, and Robert just stuck his head down in silence, and Stephen's like, "Oh man, I buggered this." But it turned out, Fripp said, you captured what was in my head, but I couldn't get it out because we only had 2 channels now with the whole field. So I'd love to hear some of your work in surround sound. Audiophile market.
Next project.
You mentioned To Live and Die in LA. My keyboard player in my band, that's his favorite Wang Chung song. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how that track came together.
I think that this, you know, like I say, earlier on, we were working on a follow-up to Points on the Curve, which wasn't going terribly well, and we essentially sort of stopped working in the studio, and had to really write some new stuff. And during that time, we got approached by William Friedkin personally, because he had heard Points on the Curve and particularly loved this track Wait on Points on the Curve, was using it as a temp track for the rushes that they were listening to every day. If I'm talking far too technically, then tell me. But anyway, so they're using Wait, you know, and that was giving him the flavour of the soundtrack that he wanted, you know. And I think maybe he worked with a more straight kind of Hollywood composer for a while, which wasn't doing it for him. So he contacted us directly and asked us if we would score the movie, you know, which is the most incredible thing to just like drop out of the blue. And that was an amazing experience. And so we did all that without seeing the film in a week, you know, like very, very quickly, because Geffen wanted us to keep working on the pop album. And I think Billy had pretty much finished the movie and was waiting to sort of cut it, you know. So we sent him all this music, and then he invited us over to Hollywood and to see what he'd done, which was one of the most exciting experiences I've ever had, sitting in a movie in this sort of like premiere theatre thing with him and the sound team, just listening to this sort of rough cut of the movie. It was amazing, you know. And when I got back to the UK, I was so sort of excited by it. You know, one of the things that Billy said to me in the initial conversations that we had, he said, what I don't want is a song called To Live and Die in LA. Okay, I just want music. I just want you to do what you do. Take your band into the studio and just jam. That's what I want, you know. So that's kind of what we did, you know. But when I got back to the UK after having seen this rough cut of the film, I was just so impressed with it. And the song To Live and Die in LA just came out, and I can't explain it any more clearly than that, really, you know. And I remember calling Nick up and said, I've written this song called To Live and Die in LA. Do you want to hear it? And played it to him. He went, yeah, it's brilliant. It's great. So we did a little demo of it and sent it to Billy, you know, and he got in touch with us immediately, because in those days, of course, you couldn't just like send it on the internet. It was like FedExing it over there and stuff, you know. And he got back and said, it's brilliant, you know, so let's cut that properly, and I'm going to reshoot the front of the movie to incorporate the song, you know, which you never get now, you know. No. So that whole opening sequence of the song, you know, which is the terrorist guy blowing himself up on the top of this building, and the you know, and the presidential kind of motorcade as well, all incredibly prescient stuff, of course, from Friedkin's part, you know. But yeah, so he reshot the front of the movie, you know, so that the song could be in it, you know. Okay. So that's what it came from, you know. In terms of what I was thinking, it was a very, especially for me in those days, songwriting was quite a sort of, it just happened. I don't know how it happened, you know. Okay. But I do remember somebody saying to me once, I love that song because it's written from the female's point of view, you know, from Chance's girlfriend's point of view. And I'd never thought that was the case, but when I listen to the lyrics, I sort of think, yeah, if anybody was singing that song, it would be her. And that made me think that this whole creative process is a very interesting one, you know.
Very cool, very cool. My friend Jamie in the chat room says, best car chase scene ever. Plus the sequence of making money with Wang Chung music was critical to the vision of the movie.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because again, because we didn't see the movie before the music, there was no way that I knew that the tempo of the track was going to match the tempo of the money printing machine, you know, right. Which it does pretty closely. Do you know what I mean? So, so again, you can't explain it. Sometimes I think you really are just in sync with whatever it is, some sort of creative force, you know, and it kind of carries you along for a while. So you have to be ready
to screenplay or the script to work from when you compose.
He did send a script. You know, I essentially had this sort of hour-long conversation with Billy on the phone when he first got in touch with us, and I just got a very clear sense of what he wanted from that conversation. And I was working on the tracks that became City of the Angels. I had those ideas, and I just kind of thought, yeah, I'll do that, and then we'll just figure it out. It was just a very inspiring time. Friedkin's an incredible guy, a very, very interesting man, incredibly educated, very sophisticated guy. Learned a huge amount from him, just hanging out with him. You know, whenever I went to LA, I'd stay with him if I could, and you know, we spent time together. Very generous guy, and you know, just inspiring, totally inspiring.
Any memories of the video for that? I watched it the other day. I hadn't seen it in probably 30 years, and it's like one of those where you and Nick are kind of recording it in the studio, supposedly, and kind of patting each other on the back, like, that's awesome take, you know.
Yeah. No, Billy sort of wanted it to be like that. You know, he sort of directed us. So that's incredible, being directed by Bill Friedkin. You know, that's it. I don't recall it terribly clearly. You know, I think some of those air punching things are a little contrived, to say the least. But just the whole thing was great. You know, and I think around that time I met Willem Dafoe as well, and Deborah Foyer, the girl who plays Chance's girlfriend. And they're really great people. Willem Dafoe especially, was very striking to meet him, like really early on in his career. And at that time he was working in sort of like New York theatre, experimental theatre. And so, you know, you meet all these people doing fascinating stuff, you know, very different stuff. It was, as I keep saying at the moment, inspiring.
Yeah. Would you be down for doing another soundtrack sometime?
Well, you know, I did a second movie for Bill called The Guardian, which was not one of his greatest movies. I think he would sort of agree with that. You know, he was going through some stuff, and I just quit Wang Chung, and so it was sort of did something together. For me, it was great because I again got at a critical point, got to write a whole load of instrumental music and stuff. You know, but would I still want to do a soundtrack? If the right thing came up, yeah. But I'm certainly not into the modern thing of scoring to picture. Do you know what I mean? I think that's mainly a complete waste of time. You know, and I find it a lot of modern movies very difficult to listen to when they're done in that way. But if there was some collision of a director and the sort of thing I do, and I could just, you know, jam out some stuff and he cut it into the movie, yeah, great. I'd be up for that.
I wanted to ask before we wrap it up a bit about your guitars over the years, and like, what were you favoring back in the 80s, and what are you using now? I see you playing a really nice white one. What do you
back in the 80s, it was like Fender Strat through a JC 120. That was the sound that everyone was after. You know,
sure. That chorus,
you know, so that was the kind of Andy Summers kind of sound. You know, but you know, guitarist in Susie and the Banshees had that sound, and so I had that, and Strats were my sort of guitar of choice, I suppose, you know. And I still have I've got a 54 Strat original thing, which is just an amazing instrument, which I still use. I think the sort of Strats sort of saw me through the 80s, really. I didn't, you know, I had 2 or 3 of them, you know, but this 54 one still knocks everything else into a cocked hat, as they say. But these days, I use I've got 2 Gretsch White Falcons. One's a slightly slimmer version, and one's a chunkier version. And I really love playing those. The slimline one, especially, is what I'm using on the. There's a new live EP that came out just digitally on Spotify of 3 other tracks that I recorded last year when we performed Primitif for the first time. Again, we just hit this little window where it was possible to do a gig here in Canterbury. So we did it sort of socially distanced band, socially distanced audience, but it was cool. You know, it's got some good energy to it. So I was using the White Falcon in that. What else? I bought myself an Epiphone Casino, or they're called an elitist these days, just through my sort of undying love for John Lennon and that kind of sort of slightly dead, funky guitar sound that he gets, you know. And,
yeah, definitely. You know, and then he went and like scraped all the varnish off his. By the time they did Let It Be, you know.
That's exactly right. The look of that guitar still, I adore. So I've got a very similar looking. You know, it's varnished, but it's got the natural finish on it. You know?
So made some great stuff, you know, and they still continue to. One way or
I read a biography of John McLaughlin actually this time last year, at the beginning of the lockdown, which was a big influence on this new album that I've done. And I ended up buying a double neck guitar on eBay, which is a beautiful instrument actually, you know, 12 string, 6 string. So I'm going to try and figure out a way that I can actually use that live at some point. So.
Oh, that sounds great. Well, bring a chiropractor.
Yeah, exactly.
I have one. You know, the trick is to put a counterweight on the end of your strap. Like I literally took a bag of buckshot and put it in a Crown Royal bag and tied it to the end of the thing, because you've got 18 machine heads and that's a lot of weight. It's
let
so
gravity work for you.
So counterbalance it. It's much easier to play, because I used to think, oh, Jimmy Page looks so cool leaning back playing that, and then I got one and I realized, oh, it's out of necessity. It's like if you don't get like this, it's going to plummet towards the floor the minute you let go. So
absolutely.
But 12 string, what a delicious sound.
It's just a great sound. Yeah,
I always enjoyed that. So before we wrap it up, let's circle back around about the book and remind everybody what the book's called and where to get it.
Yeah. So the book is called, I had it just in view actually, so I can just grab it. Just
all right.
So there you have it. So it's called The Canterbury Sound in Popular Music, Scene, Identity and Myth. And available from all good bookstores.
Your chapter is about 20-something pages, if I remember.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. So my chapter's called, what is it? Uniforms, Unicorns and the Canterbury Sound or something like that. And I roundly state there's no such thing as the Canterbury Sound.
Yeah,
it's just
there are Canterbury musicians, but there isn't a Canterbury Sound per se.
Yeah, but I'm happy to be proved wrong about that.
Can Canterbury be summoned up by people across the pond?
How do you mean summoned up?
Well, are there instances of that sound cropping up from people that didn't necessarily come from that geographical location?
I've sent Jack some Swedish Canterbury and Italian Canterbury over the nets.
Yeah, you have. Yeah. So I think it is perfectly possible, and a lot of Canterbury musicians would argue that the Canterbury geographical location was very minor in the thinking, and certainly even Soft Machine, really made all the progress that they made in London. They had to go to London to make it. So So I think it is this, it was a very good image, your triangle, jazz, rock, classical, and the Canterbury Sound being in a sort of hazy position, sort of somewhere north of rock and north of jazz, Yeah.
Well, it's wonderful music, and I think it's great.
Yeah.
You're a part of a book that really kind of shines a light on it, because
it's interesting. It's got some academic stuff, which where they're trying to sort of locate it, using sociological, technical language and stuff. But it's all kind of interesting. But there's a great thing by Richard Sinclair in there as well, and some other Sam Bailey as well, who's the guy who plays piano on my jazz projects and with me in the latest, when I do the solo stuff live, he's my keyboard player. So yeah, there's a whole sort of Canterbury-ness to it, which is really wonderful.
Yeah, and it's just wonderful music, and I think a lot of I think pretty much anybody that likes Jess and Genesis and the like will have what it takes to segue into Canterbury pretty easily.
Yeah,
and should, in case maybe they're a little tired of the obvious symphonic progressive rock. Well, Canterbury is the next stop.
Well, I think it is, yeah, and I think it has this, this influence of free jazz and stuff, which sometimes, that can be a little challenging. I know that I would have found it challenging, earlier, before my sort of head opened up to all sorts of different stuff, with Yes and Genesis, those sorts of prog bands have this very sort of structured approach to things, kind of like classical music, and pop music come to that. When the jazz thing starts to come in, it is freer, looser, and the form starts to become much more liquid. But I think that's basically it. If you've got a taste for that and an ear for that, then the Canterbury thing will make you very happy.
Won't be too much of a stretch,
Exactly.
The humor will draw you in, I think.
Yeah, there's
just reading the titles on the back of the album, you're going to be laughing.
Very funny. Yeah.
I think all three of us agree that shaving is boring from the Hatfield title.
That's right.
For sure.
It makes me think, was that what was the one Mommy was a non-stick kitchen utensil and Daddy was a asteroid. Was that a Canterbury one? I'm trying to remember now. That was Phil Manzanera's career. Who had that by its son. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
So, Jack, anything you'd like to share before we wrap it up?
No, I think we've covered a lot of ground, haven't we?
Yes.
Well, you guys,
thank you for your time.
No, I've really enjoyed it. It's very nice to talk to you guys.
Thank you, Jack. And we'd love to have you back when the new album's out. If you're up for
that'd be really nice to talk to you about that. Yeah. So we're planning on releasing a single. I think that's going to be around about May the 14th. So that would be, there's a video and this track from the album.
What's the track called?
The track is called "We Gotta Work Together."
Okay. Well, there's a lot of truth in that.
and the album should hit the shops, drop, as they say these days. I guess the production line is kind of held up because of all the current stuff, But I would hope that we try and get this album out end of July. It might be just in August, something like that, but it'll come out on vinyl, CD, and all the usual digital outlets.
Excellent. Well, I'm excited to hear it.
Looking forward to it.
Great. Yeah.
Thanks for your time again, Jack.
Thanks a million. All right, everyone, tune in this time next week. I'll be chatting with David Payton, who you might remember from the 70s, had a big hit with Ho, 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 It's Magic. And he also
Alan Parsons, right?
Alan Parsons on almost every amazing Alan Parsons album from 75 to 85. He played on the first couple Kate Bush albums. He even played on a couple Camel albums when Colin Bass was doing something else. So yeah, lots of cool stuff coming up. Well, Jack and Rob, thank you so much for taking the time to chat today. Take care, stay safe, and stay in touch. All right, you guys, y'all take care. I'll see you all next week. Take care.